And I went for my interview, like getting into the doctorate at Juilliard, right? So talk about an intimidating jury. So it's Diamond, Carter, Roger Sessions, Persichetti, and Milton Babbitt. Here I am, like, what am I doing here? In front of all these big names. Anyway, so no, but they were very nice, and it was fine. So one of the pieces I submitted was a string quartet I'd written. Anyway, so we're sort of talking about this and that, and Persichetti's like this, okay? He's like, he's looking around, okay. Then he goes over to the piano without the music, and he starts playing my string quartet from memory. He memorized it like in 2 minutes and was playing it at the piano. And he said, "You recognize this piece?" And it took me a minute. Like, well, what? You're playing my quartet from memory? After like 2 minutes, like, okay. But that was cool, because I mean, it's nice to see when your teacher is a real musician, like they can do stuff like that. Not, theory is fine, but it's nice that these people can actually do things.
Today I have the pleasure of talking to Dr. Alan Belkin. He began his musical journey on the piano and then the organ, studying at Concordia and McGill Universities before receiving his doctorate at Juilliard, where he commuted for 3 years from his home base in Montreal. That seems like a time-consuming labor of love.
It was a big sacrifice, but it was worth it.
From 1982 to 2016, Dr. Belkin taught at the University of Montreal and is now retired from faculty life to teach online. I've admired Dr. Belkin's work online for quite some time now, and I was pleased to learn recently that the feeling was mutual. How are you, Alan?
I'm fine. Thank you very much.
I kind of want to start today just by talking about not just the fact that we're composers in common, but the fact that we're also YouTube educators. Right. And you've been at it longer than I have. I started this channel in early 2016. It was completely terrible. You've been uploading educational content since December 2014 in French and February 2015 in English. Your channel has had your pieces longer than that. You've got some YouTube experience on me, so this is kind of where I want to start. How did you decide that you wanted to be an educator on YouTube? What was the journey from academia to being online?
Okay, so the first thing was, I've always liked teaching. Okay, like some people are good composers, but they don't enjoy teaching. But in my case, I really like teaching. I always have. Okay, in the university, of necessity, there's all these committees, and they have to prove this and prove that. Sometimes I found it very constraining. Okay, also, they decide the program that goes this way and that way. I sort of felt, okay, I have my own approach. So I was doing it at university, and I thought, I became aware of the internet. Just like everybody else, starting about 15, 20 years ago. I think this is interesting. What could it be interesting stuff? And I started thinking, well, still while I was at the university, I was thinking, if you give a course like a harmony course or a counterpoint course, there's two things. One thing is you're explaining the material, and that generally doesn't change from year to year. Like elementary harmony, the material has not changed in the past 10 years, in a big way. So the explanation, it seems to me, why not just record the explanation and then spend the time with the students looking at specific examples, suggesting improvements for their own work and so on. Whereas as it is now, the teacher prepares the same thing every single year. Just seemed to be sort of wasteful. And since I taught pretty much all the courses, orchestration, harmony, counterpoint, composition, and so on, well, why don't we try that? Anyway, but the university wasn't interested. This is a long time ago. They weren't into that. So for a long time, I was sort of thinking, well, I'd really like to do this. And then finally came on, they let me do it in French, but the recording wasn't very good, and it wasn't really all that well thought out. Anyway, I started thinking, well, I'm going to be retiring soon. I'm going to have the time. So why don't I now start thinking about doing something online? And then I saw Thomas Goss, Orchestration Online. I started getting to know some of these people and seeing, the level is sometimes very good. Not always, but if the group is well moderated, it's not crap. There's interesting stuff there. And in my case, another thing that happened was that for a bunch of reasons, not too important, my own training had some big holes in it. Okay. So some of it was good in a very sort of academic way. Some of it really just was not useful to me at all. So when I started teaching, I had this rule that I thought to myself, I thought, okay, rule of pedagogy is that if there's, let's say your subject, if you know 90% of your subject, guarantee you that a student will ask a question in the 10% you don't know. Okay, for sure. Okay. So I thought, well, that was kind of, the important thing at that point is what you should say is, I don't know, but I'll look into it. So over time, I started to discovering, I got into reading other stuff about psychology of perception and so on. gradually realizing that certain things, there were better explanations than the one I was given, put it that way. Okay, so as you know, I would be teaching counterpoint and something. I would say, are we allowed to do parallel fifths? And I said, you're asking the wrong question. Okay, the question isn't whether you're allowed to do it. The question is, does it fit in this context? Like when Debussy does parallel fifths, there'll be a whole passage, so it's not one weird thing. You have two parallel fifths and you have like 4 minutes of music that are all thirds and sixths. It's going to sound weird. In that context, it just doesn't fit. So we're talking about perception. We're not talking about biblical injunctions that, you know, you go to hell if you write parallel fifths. Okay, but often they were taught that way. They just think that these rules, and these rules are like, you can't negotiate them. Another thing that came up at one point, really important thing, is like, I started thinking about what's really salient. So I have an article on my website on salience. The point was that I could write parallel fifths that anybody will notice. I could also write parallel fifths that you will see them, but nobody will hear them. In the middle of a 4-part texture with a suspension in another voice, that, you know, that's a whole different game. And it's important as a composer to be as realistic as possible in your hearing. So I would start thinking, instead of saying these are parallel fifths, I would say to the students, how prominent are these? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is a nuclear bomb and 1 is unnoticeable, where do you put this one? And that gets you into all kinds of stuff. Because let's say you say, well, this is really about a 5. Next question is why? This is, well, you know, because it's on not the same beat, and all this stuff. And you get the students starting to think about how hearing really works, how our auditory perception really works. And that is useful for a composer. Because most of us, you know, don't write in species counterpoint style. I assume you're not writing species counterpoint at this stage, right? You don't spend all your composition time working on species counterpoint, right? Neither do I. It's just a pedagogical thing to get to a certain place, but it's not the goal in itself. So if you get people to really think about, why do I notice this over here as opposed to over there, that's something you can use in your own composition. You can say, okay, well, maybe in theory there's a problem here, but is it really audible? Because often the difference between what you see and what you hear is very substantial. You know, the classic example, I was once score reading a Mahler symphony, and I spent like 2 hours on 2 pages, and I finally, okay, I think I'd play this on the piano. And okay, I'm going to go listen to it. And what do I hear is whoosh, a cymbal crash, which wiped out everything else for 3 hours. And I thought, you know, I've spent all this time working on this stuff. And like, in reality, the cymbal crash drowns everything out. So I thought, well, that's good to know that. You know, I hadn't noticed it because there's one note in a page that was an absolute forest. But, you know, that's the kind of thing. What you see and what you hear aren't always the same. And the composer should be paying a lot of attention to what you hear. Okay, so that, anyway, that got me to thinking that maybe I have something to offer that, you know, I didn't want to go online and teach the same stuff that everybody else teaches the same way. What's the point? But, well, if I have something to offer that's out of the ordinary and maybe useful, then so that kind of got me thinking of what could, at first I did the modern harmony course, then, you know, and the, you know, applied counterpoint and so on. And, but you know, most of these courses try to get very, very down to earth and sort of practical, and hopefully to present things in ways that are very useful to composers, and you know, and not just the standard stuff that everybody else does. So that's where I got interested, and then I started getting a lot of good feedback about it. So you know, it took off.
There's a real practical element to a lot of what you do. It's not just like, here's different orchestration techniques, have at it. It's like there's an integrated aspect of the harmony that you use, the instrumentation, the orchestration, the form. Like these are all this is all an interconnected web. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have one ear for counterpoint, another for harmony. One thing I would say to students, let's say in counterpoint, I say, you know, at the beginning we're working in a very rigid framework, but this is just pedagogical. Let's say exercising your muscles. You need resistance. But the idea is just to get you fluent, to get to the point where you see right away 5 solutions in a situation. But what happens at a certain stage in counterpoint, you need rich harmony. And in harmony also, at a certain stage, you need very detailed voice leading to make the inner voices interesting. So there's a point where they meet. At another point, orchestration becomes part of it too. It's very different writing for chorale and writing for a brass quintet. You know, it's not the same thing at all. They're very big differences. And, you know, if you shouldn't teach them like it's all the same. So, you know, at the beginning, we simplify things just because you can't have a beginner thinking about 20 things at the same time. That's understandable. But at a certain point, you have to be able to say, okay, now we have to think about the influence of orchestration or tempo or what have you on this, you know, this particular kind of thing. I have one student now who's a trombone player, who's a compositionist to replace trombone. So, of course, with him, I don't have to explain the usual problems with brass instruments. You know, students who don't know anything but brass, you know, they assume that it can play passages that are just ridiculous, right? Or I don't have to explain to him that a trombone playing middle C is louder than a flute normally. Like even if you mark the flute triple forte, and you mark the trombone forte, there's no question who wins that competition, right? But that kind of stuff, like people who have no experience, don't know that stuff. And they don't mention it like even, I mean, the orchestration book might say the flute is quieter in its lower register, but he's been in an orchestra and he's played trombone, like it wouldn't even occur to him to try something like that. It's obvious to him. But that kind of stuff, a lot of people need that kind of like explanation. It has to be down to earth. And it can get very refined also, but I like to feel like it gets down to earth. And as I said before, big, really important side to, auditory perception. Yeah, I don't know if you know that book by Albert Bregman, Auditory Scene Analysis. You know that book?
I do not. There are plenty of books, but I hardly have them all.
He was a psychologist at McGill. I think he's retired now. Very, very interesting. He did research into auditory perception. Anyway, the question he asked himself was, like, let's say you and I are walking down the street, okay, and there's a dog barking somewhere, and there's cars going by, and somebody blasts their horn or something. How, generally speaking, we have no trouble keeping track of each other's conversation, despite all those other noises coming in. He was like, how do we sort of separate those things into auditory streams? That was his term, okay? I read the book and I thought, this is relevant to orchestration, right? Like when you orchestration, you talk about planes of tone. Well, that's streaming, the auditory streaming. That's what he's talking about. And a lot of his principles in the book are exactly the same ones we use in orchestration to tell you whether this blends with that or is this going to stand out. So sort of thinking like, perception has a lot to say about these things and relevant stuff to say. I mean, you probably know David Huron, right? The psychologist, he wrote a book called Sweet Anticipation about how much of classical music is just about expectations. So once you have a music that's developing patterns, then you can develop expectations and then you can play with them. Doesn't mean you always give the listener what they expect, but it means once you've got expectations, you can play with it, which is, it's a huge, area of potential for the composer. And we haven't invented that. It's been around for a long time. But things like that, I started reading, I thought, this is actually in some ways a better explanation than some of the older explanations that were just about style, let's say. I mean, style is real and everything, but this is a more comprehensive thing. And also partly because of part of my musical education that was very sort of stylistically rigid. I mean, they sort of thought, I didn't never like Stockhausen. And that for some people, so you're not a composer, you don't like modern music. This in 1970s, he was the in person you had to like, right? So when I got to Juilliard, like nobody wanted to impose that kind of stuff. So it became important to me to teach in a way that's relatively style neutral. Like I don't want to tell the composer what style he should be writing in. I just want to give the composer tools to do whatever they want better. That's my job. As much obviously I have criteria. It's not totally random, but it's more open. I've had pop composers come to me, and I've had classical quote unquote composers come to me. And, they want different things, and my job is just trying to get them to do it better. So that sort of was another area where I felt there wasn't much being done, and I felt I could add something in that department, sort of style neutral stuff, but finding general principles that didn't only apply to classical music. So that was another area that kind of, okay, there's room to work here because there weren't a lot of people doing stuff.
Yeah, you mentioned like trying to be style neutral is something that certainly like in my research of like great composers who are also many of them were teachers, but not a lot of them were like great teachers in that sense. Like reading about Schoenberg or Elliott Carter, it's like they wrote very specific music, but they never imposed it on someone else. Versus someone like Morton Feldman, who like ruined a bunch of composers because he only could teach his style.
Yeah, I mean that's a big point, because I mean obviously a composer, I think, should have their own style, their own voice, if we want to put it that way. Okay, that's a different thing, but that's up to each person to discover, and maybe I can help with it, but it doesn't mean I can tell you what style to write it. I'm not going to say, well, Thomas, you really should be writing serial music or tonal music, whatever. That's ridiculous. The idea is that you should be writing the music you want to write as well as you can. Right? Now, somebody else might want to do something totally different, and that's okay too. I always thought that was kind of cool, Sondheim, studied with Babbitt. And Sondheim is a tonal composer, and he sort of said, Babbitt obviously was not a tonal composer himself, but he was sort of said, look, you're a tonal composer, and he was okay with that. I thought it was kind of cool that he was open in that way, as opposed to teachers that I had known. It was like, well, if you don't like Stockhausen, you're not a composer. That kind of rigidity. There's more place in the world for that, I think, anyway.
Yeah, and you studied, you had sort of brief encounters with Elliott Carter, from what I understand, but
Yeah,
you mostly studied with David Diamond.
David Diamond, yeah. Yeah, well, Diamond was my main advisor, okay? Like when I came into Juilliard, he was my teacher for the first few years. Then he was on sabbatical, but at that point I didn't need weekly lessons. So that year, Carter took me, like I saw Carter, I think 5 times total, once a month or so for 4 or 5 months, something like that. So that was, I mean, got to know him a little bit, and I have a couple of funny stories about that. He's a very different kind of teacher from Diamond. Um, Carter, for example, he didn't pay much attention to encouraging me, okay? Once after a lesson, I came down to the cafeteria and I was talking with some other student. And I said, he never sort of says anything that it's good. I said, he looked at this little passage over here and he said, oh, that's kind of nice. And the other guy said, he said it was nice? Oh my God. Like that was like the biggest compliment you could get out of Carter. He said this was pretty, this little passage, okay? Diamond, not Diamond wouldn't say it's a masterpiece, but he took pains to sort of encourage you along the way. But that said, I mean, I remember, I think the second lesson with Carter, I was going home to Montreal. I had to commute for those lessons. I was coming on Montreal. I was thinking, I don't think I know anything. Like, he's telling me all this stuff, and like, I don't know anything. He was taking one page of score, and like, why are you putting the flute over here? Why are you doing that? But then I started thinking as I was on the plane coming over, I thought, I shouldn't be upset about that. I should be happy about that because it means I'm learning stuff, right? That's not why I'm coming here. So I sort of think, okay, it's good. Like, okay, so maybe I feel like an idiot because I don't know so much. But I mean, at the same time, when I'm through with that, I'll know a lot more than I did before, which was the case. And I got, a lot of things he said, even though my own music has zero to do with Carter's style. I mean, nothing like that. Nonetheless, he was a very intelligent man. He thought very deeply about many things. Sometimes he would sort of say something. I remember one time I came into a lesson at the beginning of an orchestra piece. It started off, I think, with a long pedal point or something with the diminuendo. And Carter says, well, don't start a piece with a long diminuendo. So first I thought, why not? And then I started thinking about that, I think, yeah, dynamics have something to do with form. Crescendos add energy, diminuendos lose energy. So all of the things being equal, it's true. It's not a good idea to start a piece with a long diminuendo. Now you could counteract it, let's say, with a very dissonant harmony or something. But the idea, it sort of got me in, like he sort of threw something at me, and then I feel like I ran with the ball after that. Like, okay. Then I started thinking about dynamics in all kinds of ways. He even got me seeing Beethoven differently because Beethoven is the first one to use those, crescendo up to piano kind of thing, subito piano. And I started thinking about that. It sort of opened the door, So he just said that one comment about, don't start a piece with a long diminuendo. It'll end up like, oh, I never thought about dynamics before, and all of a sudden I was thinking about that. So a lot of what he said was like that. You sort of, if you were interested, it was like, okay, now I get it. Now I see there's something interesting to talk about there. So that was a very, very cool kind of thing. I mean, Diamond was good that way too, but in a different style. I think Diamond enjoyed the teaching more than Carter did.
Yeah, that's what I got from my own research on Carter, and also talking to David Schiff a while back, who studied with him like on a basis when he was at Juilliard.
Right.
That's another thing. Like his music is much more tonal. Your music is much more tonal than this. Like,
oh yeah.
But you have this wildly atonal composer who's able to give good, competent advice. And that's a good model for teachers. Yeah.
Yes, I don't think he would have taught me like for 3 years necessarily. I think at a certain point, would have seen that I wasn't going in his direction. But nonetheless, what he gave me was useful, and I was very glad to have those few lessons with him. Definitely, it was definitely worth it. I mean, Diamond was closer to the kind of music that I write for myself. Okay, but again, Diamond also was mostly concentrating on craftsmanship, and that's what I wanted. After having been to the other place where it was all about style and Stockhausen and everything, I just like. Since I was a little kid, I wanted to write symphonies. So I didn't want somebody to tell me that nobody writes symphonies today. That's ridiculous. Write like Stockhausen. I want them to say, well, okay. Well, Diamond, having written himself eventually 11 symphonies, he wasn't cool to the idea of, he wasn't into like not writing symphonies. He could understand somebody wanting to write symphonies. So, even though my own style was also very different from Diamond. I mean, I learned a lot from him. He was a strange guy too in his own way. I mean, he had other things about him, but I didn't have not many. He had some personal characteristics, shall we say, that sometimes were very offensive to some people. I didn't have the problem with it, but he did sometimes. I mean, and again, I was very glad, and I feel I learned a lot from him. But let's just say, when he was drunk, he could come up with some very surprising things. But his style was more spontaneous. Like when I was writing my first symphony, at one point I had a problem somewhere. and he improvised a transition in front of me, and that was really cool. I thought, oh, I need to learn about transitions, right? He never explained it. He just improvised one, and then I managed to do it. And then many years later, I started thinking about transitions in my textbook of composition. Unbelievably, I've never found another textbook about composition that has a chapter on transitions. You might have a chapter on transitions in sonata form, but not the issue of connecting one idea with the next, which when you think about it is wacko. Because I mean, any music that's more than 40 seconds long is going to need to connect one idea with another one. So why don't we ever talk about how to connect things? Because there's a whole lot to say about that. So I just thought, well, here's an area where I can say something that isn't just what everybody else has already said. So, but again, his doing it in front of me sort of got me thinking, so, okay, what makes a good transition? And then years later, I sort of felt in a position to say something about that in my own work. Like basically, let's say you want to connect idea A and idea B, okay? Now, they can be very similar or extremely contrasting, okay? So if you want to think about it systematically, here's what you do. You make a list of all the differences, let's say orchestration, dynamics, register, motives. You just make a list of absolutely everything you notice that's different. And not just pitches. I mean, we're talking orchestration, tempo, so stuff. And then the basic rule of transitions is this, is that what takes a lot of work is a gradual, like anybody can make a sudden bump. You don't need a lot of technique to do that. But to make a transition that's really gradual, that takes more technique. So the rule is this, is you only change one thing at a time. Like don't change the orchestration and the motive at the same time. Keep the motive the same and change the orchestration. Then keep the orchestration the same and change the motive. And I'm thinking that, which the corollary to that is the more contrast there is between two ideas, the longer the transition is going to be if it's extremely smooth, okay? Now, that doesn't mean in real life you always want the smoothest transition, but having understood that technically gives you control over transitions so that when you decide this one is a little too smooth, it's very easy to make it a little punchier. Or you decide it's too sudden, then it's easy to see, okay, the reason it's too sudden is because I change register and I modulate it at the same time or whatever. So it's finally figure out a way of thinking about transition. It's systematic and it can be applied to any style. You can always make a list of what's different. I mean, the example I would give is, let's say you have a beginning like a Mozart sonata, and after that you want to have a special effects trombone piece. Okay, like that's pretty far. Okay, but it's doable. You just got to find somewhere where the Mozart sonata reaches a certain rhythm, and then have the trombone come in on the same notes with the same rhythm, and then the trombone can begin to bend the notes or whatever you want to do with it. But you're looking for commonalities, and at each step there has to be at least one thing in common. And that is the recipe for doing a gradual transition. And once you have control, it's astonishing how much easier it makes controlling the form of a piece.
It sounds also similar to the recipe for building an argument, is that you have to state facts that back up your position and things like. And if you have a non sequitur, that can be a dramatic effect, but it's hard to call that a transition.
Should be intentional. I mean, nothing wrong with dramatic transitions, but I mean, just in the same way, you wouldn't write a novel where every chapter started off and then something weird happened. This is okay, but not 20 chapters in a row. So another rule I found is that most of the time, sudden transitions are rarer than gradual transitions on the whole. Really sudden things. They're good and they're really important, but they don't happen like every 3 bars because usually the piece ends up sounding incoherent if there's too much contrast in too short a time. Anyway, it got me thinking about all this stuff in a way that I had never seen before. I thought, that could be useful, and it's certainly useful to me in my own music. And students also I did a series of transition exercises, just pairs of ideas, and I say, write 3 transitions between each pair, totally different ones, okay? But make them as gradual as possible. Normally, the average student, the first time they tried it was a disaster because they'd be changing things without realizing they're changing things. If they would change the motive and the register and your instrument at the same time, I'd sort of say, no, don't do all that at the same time. Do one at a time. And then by the second week, people go click, they got it. And then all of a sudden they have a technical kind of facility they never had before. So it was a lot of fun to sort of see something like that, So the fact that Diamond demonstrated a transition to me got me to there. He never explained it, but then I got to think of it like, oh, that's cool, and that could use that in an interesting way. Anyway, I found that idea kind of fascinating, and it led me to sort of going places with that. There's a lot of stuff like that where you think about it. Some of this stuff is like, it's almost common sense. Like obviously Beethoven knew how to write a transition, right? He didn't have anything to learn about that. So did Brahms and so on. But I mean, they could make them gradual or sudden as they wished, because they had the technique to do that. Just they never talked about it, right? But sometimes it's worth talking about if you want to understand something, you know.
I was just wondering how much of that was stuff that they maybe knew subconsciously by just study and analysis. You know, Brahms taking 20 years to, you know, poring over Beethoven symphonies just to write one. How much of that is filtered in ways they just couldn't maybe put into words, and you seem to have put into words.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's obviously, you know, as a composer, I'm not in their league, but I mean, I just think sometimes if you can explain something better. Another example I'm sure you'll know about is like serialism can be explained in several ways. Some of them are totally useless. When they just give you the catalog of all the roll positions and the inversions and everything else, like basically that doesn't help you at all to make any choices. That just gives you a catalog, okay? But no composer who has, you know, no real composer just chooses indifferently in the catalog of transpositions and inversions. So that is not a way to write a good piece. So then the real job with serialism is to understand how can it be useful? How do I decide what to do here or there? How do I decide, you know, how do I choose this transposition as opposed to that one? You know, there are all kinds of decisions, but that's the part that you need to discuss. The other stuff you can explain in 5 minutes, but that doesn't make you a good composer. You know, you can explain the basics of serialism. They're not complicated intellectually. But once you get into using it in the piece, that's a whole other story, right? And then you can get all kinds of audible criteria. And if you can explain that, then there's something worth talking about.
Yeah, and I was reading. Hold on. Let me see if I can get it up without destroying it. There's a whole hidden section on a bookshelf that no one gets to see because it's below the camera. But I've been reading some of the essays from Milton Babbitt. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So and there was an interesting point in here about. I'm going to try to summarize it because it's a lot of technical language, but it was about how you know Schoenberg and the origin of the 12-tone system, you know, wasn't necessarily in a row or a series and like here's the 12 notes. He was thinking of them as like as not really a row. Like row is not a very good translation from the German, and Schoenberg didn't have good English, so he didn't have a good name for it. So there are all there's problems with the ways that we call serial sets and serial rows, and you know, and then you look at like Lulu by Berg, and it's like it's full of all these complicated serial procedures that simply can't be explained. They're still serial, but they can't be explained in terms of like a strict ordering. And there's part of me that's wondering, you know, looking at the development of serialism and specifically American serialism is, you know, maybe the influence of Webern was just too strong. You know, maybe the use of 12 tones as a thematic motive was just overwhelming.
Yeah. Did you ever look at Berg's first serial piece, that song called Schließe mir die Augen beide?
Yeah. Hold on,
that piece is a hoot. That piece is a hoot because the first page you encounter notes, and the second page is like, huh? What happened? You know? But to me, what happened is that Berg just he used the series as an idea, not as a sort of a law that says A has to come after C sharp all the time. You know, he used it as an idea, and then his own musical imagination got stimulated by it, and then he went on farther. And of course, the violin concerto, I mean, as a series, it's a bunch of seventh chords, really, you know, on a whole tone scale on top. Well, surprise, surprise, Berg's favorite harmonic entities are seventh chords on whole tone scales. Gee, what a surprise, you know? In other words, Berg chose a series that fit the kind of character that he wanted, okay? And that, you know, that I would say is one of the most important lessons. If you want to use serialism, it shouldn't take away your style from you. You know, if it's taking away your style, there's something wrong. If on the other hand, it can augment your style or make it larger, hey, that's cool, you know? I mean, you know, that I think a lot of people, again, because the explanation, it's sort of like the explanation of parallel fifths I talked about before. People take it as a biblical thing. You can't do this, you must do that. That's not how a composer works. It doesn't work like that at all. You get ideas from things and then they take you off in some direction. And you might, you know, do something that's in the system or something that isn't, but that's not the point. The point is a good piece. Okay? And a good piece is not defined by whether it's 100% serial or not. That's not the definition of a good piece. But if it stimulates you and gives you interesting stuff, hey, cool. You know, but that, you know, it's a different attitude to the whole thing. And again, and I don't think Schoenberg, you know, himself was rigid in that way. I mean, he wrote, you know, strict serial pieces, although it was only pitch serialism, not rhythms or anything else. But I mean, you know, he was, you know, he also said even at the end of his life, there's a lot of good music still be written in C major. You know, so he wasn't, you know, dogmatic in that sense about it, and that's good. But I agree with Webern. I mean, it's interesting that Webern's serialism is a particular kind, and for those small pieces, it works. You know, but they're not 45-minute pieces, and they're not very dramatic things either. That says something, you know. I don't think Webern's serialism would be easy to do in that situation. And personally, I mean, I'm not even sure. I mean, you know, Schoenberg is one of those composers that I respect a lot, but I don't love everything he wrote. Some things I think are great, but other things, like, they kind of leave me cold, you know. So some of the serial pieces, I wouldn't say, you know, they're beautifully done. I would never say they're badly done, but I can't say that, you know, I'm just dying to hear them again. You know what I mean? Like, there's sometimes you hear a piece, maybe like a Shostakovich symphony, is like, I want to hear that piece again. You know, you get this immediate feeling. I don't always get that from Schoenberg. You know, with Berg more often. I have this feeling like, I want to go do this again. You know, but I don't think Berg was terribly rigid about it, because he was a real composer and his ear was his guide, and it was a very educated ear, obviously. And, you know, he uses it as a starting point. You know, some people say that Lulu was written with 3 different series instead of just 1 different series. And as you know, I'm sure, you know, if you try to analyze it, it's not a simple thing. You know, look, the serial stuff in Lulu, it gets pretty like, what the hell is going on over here at a certain point? But what's going on is he's using his ear, and he's using the series, singular or plural, as a source of inspiration, not as a biblical injunction what not to do. So that makes all the difference, you know. In other words, if you're a good composer, you can do something interesting with series, and if you're not, it's not going to make you into a good composer. That's what it comes down to, you know. My favorite serial composer is Della Piccolo.
I haven't delved deeply into his works, but everything I've heard of his is just like, this is serial? Really?
Yeah.
It sounds so nice, which is a horrible thing to say immediately, but you know, there's so much of that of stuff that it sounds, you know, the like, you know, early Boulez is like, that's what people think of serialism as being, even people who are more educated.
Yeah. Another general principle that struck me among other things when looking at serialism and all that kind of stuff was that one thing, like I did a video on YouTube called General Principles of Harmony. The point was, are there things that classical harmony has in common with modern harmony, quote unquote? Okay. And one thing, when I started thinking about it, I thought, well, one thing that definitely, in my opinion, should be in common, and to me, this is sometimes a defect in some of Schoenberg's pieces, I would call it variety of interval tension. Like, I don't like pieces where it's like some of the Schoenberg, I find it's so intense that these extreme sort of cluster dissonances, it never breathes. It's like, after a while, you just like, you want to have a little breathing. Della Piccola and Berg, certainly it breathes. You know, there are times that are very intense, but the intensity is not a straight line. When I listen to a long piece, I don't want a straight line. I want it to breathe. You know, now the way Berg does it isn't the same way Mozart does it, obviously, but nonetheless, the issue of variety of, you know, giving the shape, giving the piece an interesting shape, to me, that's like, yeah, that I think that, you know, I can relate to that. Another issue is cadence. We know from psychology that human memory cannot memorize large blocks of random information. Like, you know, you can take, if I give you a sequence of 500 letters in a row, not in words, and said, please memorize it, Thomas, no. However, if we give you a text that contained all the same letters, but in the text, it's much easier to memorize. So we need punctuation, we need organization. So again, in serial music, punctuation isn't 5-1 like in Mozart, but that doesn't mean it doesn't need to have punctuation sometimes. It needs to breathe. It's just, okay, this starting something else over here. And that's a psychological need. It's not a stylistic need. It's like, just because human brains aren't made to take in nonstop smooth stuff that has no variation anywhere. It's just, we find it very hard to, maybe that's okay for background music, but for music, like the kind of music you and I write, we want to be listened to with full attention. You're not writing music to be listened to in elevators, right? That's not your goal in life, to write elevator music, right? Nor mine. So we write music that somehow is memorable. To be memorable, you know Daniel Kahneman is?
I know I've heard the name.
Very important. He wrote like a fantastic psychological book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Okay, this is a book literally that I think I learned more than from any other psychology book I've ever read in my life. Okay? It's a fantastic book. It became a big bestseller. Anyway, just here's a little anecdote that, you know, you think, what does this have to do with music? But you'll see right away. So Kahneman tells about an experiment with people having a colonoscopy. Now, a colonoscopy is not my idea of a good, fun time, right? Okay. So here's the experiment. So the experiment says they're having these people doing colonoscopies, and they ask them, would you mind if we record it? And please tell us when it hurts or when it doesn't hurt. Like, we're to say, does it hurt now or not? So the people would say, does it hurt? Not much. Does it hurt? Oh, it hurts a lot. You know, so the people are doing it with their anecdote like this. Now, the interesting thing is this. A month later, they go back to the same people and they asked them, what was your memory of the colonoscopy? And their memory had nothing to do with what they actually said was happening. There was somebody could have had 25 minutes of like, oh my God, I can't stand it, this is horrible, but the last 5 minutes were okay. And they said, yeah, it was all right. And they could have had 25 minutes that was fine, but the last 3 minutes were terrible. I'll never do that again. It was disgusting. So that tells you that memory is not democratic. Memory has salience, like beginnings, endings, major turning points. We notice those things. In between, you don't notice it so much. It's more or less duration independent. That has enormous implications for music when you think about it, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure you've heard, just as I have, pieces that were very nice, but the ending is so-so, and you always think, who cares? Just because the ending is the point where if there's one moment you want the listener to remember, the ending should be that moment. So if the ending is nothing, is like, okay, big deal, you know? So I remember reading that and thinking, okay, this is really important, and not just for life, it's important in music too, okay? That says something about, like I say, a musical form is not a democratic thing. There are certain moments that should be an arm more salient than others. And if you want those to stand out, you'd better understand how to make things salient. And the big rule is contrast effects. You know, if it rains for 5 days and it rains again, you don't even notice it. It rains for 5 days and it's sunny. Oh my God, it's sunny. That's wonderful. And then if it's sunny for 5 days, like, okay, it's sunny. You know, you notice contrast much more than you notice things going on the same way. You know, does that ring a bell musically? I mean, maybe does that relate to certain things we can think of in music?
Tons of them. I mean, you have a whole essay on salience on your website, and I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit, because you mentioned some of the examples from that a little bit earlier, like the parallel fifths. Yeah. Sometimes you can have parallel fifths that are okay because they don't really sound outside the style.
You don't notice them. Yeah.
Another example would be, you know, just because you're using the same set class doesn't mean that you're going to be able to recognize that coming back. You can use the same thing, but different orchestration, different spacing. Yeah. Towards the end of that, you speak about how there's a need for a theory of salience.
Yes.
What do you think that might entail? Like, how might we go about formulating that in a useful way? Is it going to pull from like psychology and how brains remember sound more so than strict music theory? Or do you have any?
I think it has some of all. Obviously, musical salience is not separate from salience in everyday life. I mean, you know, it's one department. Okay. I mean, there are certain things in music that are specific. Obviously, like we know, for example, that if you play a piece for somebody who's not a trained musician, we're not talking with people like us who've had lots of ear training and so on. You know, if you play a piece for them and you change, you know, you play a passage and then you change the orchestration, they're more likely to notice the difference than if you change 3 notes in the middle, unless they're super dissonant or something. One of my standard jokes in a class is go, what's the piece that's da 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 da? Or he says Beethoven's Fifth, and I said no, I just sang a minor third. Beethoven's Fifth starts with a major third, but nobody notices because the punch of that beginning is like, oh yeah, da 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 da. Okay, that tells you something, you know. That tells you that the overall, the tempo, the character, the dynamics sometimes are much more important than the pitches. Again, I'm nothing against pitch, and I love harmony, but it's important when you're composing to think of what's going to have the most salient effect on the listener. So I think we have the advantage in the sense that since we have trained ears, we've done a lot of ear training. If you sort of then say to yourself, okay, even with all my ear training, what about this particular passage is the most important thing in giving it its musical character? Then you'll often find yourself thinking, oh yeah, it's the register or the articulation or the orchestration or whatever, you know. I think a psychologist has the advantage. Like, I'm not a researcher in that sense. Like I wouldn't know how to set up the kind of controlled experiments that say David Uren has done in musical psychology. But I think ideally I would see there as being some kind of a cooperation between some composers and at the same time, you know, some people like Uren are interested in how musical perception works. You know, I don't know if it's 100%, you know, absolutely rigid, but I mean, we can say there's certain things like details of harmony or details of melody sometimes, you know, mostly are not as salient as, let's say, orchestration, unless they really stick out from the context in some way. You know, that would stick out more. But other than that, you don't really notice those little, even though we as composers have been known to spend many a week sort of, what should I use, a C sharp or a C natural over there? You know, you're worrying about that. I mean, I've done that too. But sometimes it's important to start with the thing that's the most, you know, that has the most effect. So to me, that's a super important thing. just in teaching and in composing and in teaching composition. So, again, I can't tell you the experimental method. And I think that good composers have certainly thought about that stuff. But I would like to see some serious research about that.
There's two things that brought to mind. First is it does explain the music of certain. I'm thinking Boulez here, like Boulez with his fantastic ear. Sometimes I'll listen to his music, like it's really richly orchestrated. But it can be all over the place. Like there's just these gestures and you're going this way and you're going that way. Yeah. I'm wondering how much of that was because he had such an ear. He needed to keep everything interesting all the time, which made it hard for him to compose and also gave him a certain affectation.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Boulez is an interesting case because he started off very ideological. There's all total serious. Later on, things aren't quite so rigid. Later on, and obviously, he heard what he was doing. He was not writing just notes, dots on paper. Okay, but my own feeling is that, like, I feel that I originally would said this about minimalism, but it applies in the other direction too. The idea being that, like, if all the dimensions of the music are minimalist, it's probably going to be boring. If nothing changes, after a while, like, I'm not really interested to listen to half an hour of somebody playing a C major triad with no changes. Okay, that's a nice philosophical thing, but as music, not my thing, right? On the other hand, if everything changes all the time, at a certain point, you just can't make sense of it. You kind of give up. It's like, okay, whatever, and that, like Euron's thing about how much of music is built on creating expectations and then playing with them. Obviously, if everything is so complicated that it sounds random to the average listener, they don't get involved the same way. They just, they can't get into it. So sometimes if somebody wants to have something that say is very orchestrally, varied all the time, let's say maybe there's something to be said for keeping the pitch structure pretty simple, like that, for example, or whatever. Whereas I haven't as yet been convinced by any music where everything is super changing all the time very fast. Personally, it doesn't do it for me, obviously, other people might get off on it, and that's fine, but I have a problem with that, and the same thing on the other side with the minimal stuff where nothing changes, like, all right, already, big deal. Yeah. So, I tend to think the human perception has certain limits, and, at a certain point, if it's too complicated, it just sounds random. We sort of, okay, whatever, right? And then you sort of stop trying to get into it, because a lot of what involves us in music is you perceive a pattern, and then okay, they're going to go there, you're going to go over here. What are we going to do with that? And then, as we know, the composer can play with that in a million different ways, and it's fantastic. Anyway, so that's how I see that particular thing. I think some of Boulez's later stuff is actually less restless that way. Like it's not as restless as some of the early music. So it seems like it's just calmer in that way. So, but it may be. I mean, obviously his ear was really out of the ordinary. I mean, I think he had a kind of hearing that I certainly don't have that kind of hearing. So it's an interesting idea.
What you're talking about in terms of salience is not just applicable to Western music either. Like there are always different parameters of music that are present in music from traditions all over the world, and you could use this to really analyze how these things work. Because I mean, I'm no expert in a lot of these, quote unquote world musics, but I've played Balinese gamelan for a good while, from sophomore year of college up until this time last year, and it was really interesting to me how there are these patterns, and it's very minimalistic in the sense like there are individual sections which are very complicated, polyrhythmically, and then as soon as you get to a point where it seems like it might be getting boring, boom, you change. There's like some flourish, and then you're doing something completely different. There are few transition passages, at least in the stuff that I play. There's not really transitions. There's sudden shifts, and it's like there's a great amount of salience in these sections which really keep you interested. And
and also, I mean, most of the non-Western music I've listened to, I took courses in ethnomusicology at one point. Most of it tends to be minimalist in one or more directions, not all at the same time, dimensions, not all at the same time. Like they might be only using 5 different pitches, but the rhythm is fantastically interesting or something, or it's all being done on 5 different gongs or whatever, So there's one part of the music that's very limited and sort of framed, and within that, there's a lot of fantasy and a lot of playing around. But that means that it develops a kind of a norm, and then when you need a contrast, they change something big, So it's the same principle in a way, though, because again, the contrast need to be salient. At a certain point, if it isn't salient, it's like, all right, already, I've had enough. So you need different degrees. That's what I said before. The difference between the smoothest transitions and the bumpy ones is basically salience. And the smoothest ones, you almost don't know something is happening. And the bumpy ones are like pow, and everything in between. And as a composer, you need everything in between. You don't want big bumps, and you don't always want nothing but smooth. Certainly not for a long piece. But, you need both. So it's sort of the same thing. Like at what point do you need to sort of get the listener like, oh, what's that? As opposed to, okay. And I think this is another thing that also could be used in a style neutral way.
Yeah, for sure. There's a wide range of styles between, gradual change.
Sure.
I don't want to use a minimalist example because I don't think it's very good based on what we're talking about, but I'm thinking of like piano phase, for instance, where like there is change, right? It's still minimal, but the change is very
yeah, it's subtle and gradual. Yeah.
Versus like Mahler 6 of these hammer blows, which is, and there's so much room between those two poles, just as there's so much room between Boulez on one end and like Philip Glass on the other.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the expressive potential is very great, I think. So again, that's why I'm so interested in this style neutral stuff, because my style is my own, but other people can and have come up with wonderful music, in all kinds of different styles. So another interesting question when you get into this kind of thing, like, okay, let's say we think about things in a style neutral way. So what are criteria for quality? Does that mean there are no criteria at all for quality? Well, I happen to think there are personally. That doesn't mean I'm right, but to me, I need to feel that the piece involves me, which means it has to at least have enough pattern that I can sort of latch on to. Okay, I think I know what's happening. Then I develop expectations. To me, that's a big one. Another thing is the character vivid. Like very often in beginners orchestration, the most common defect is they double too much. And I keep saying, well, if you double all the time, you've basically given away most of your contrast. If the oboe's been playing the whole time, when the oboe solo comes along, it doesn't do anything. But if the oboe shuts up for 40 bars and you have an oboe solo, wow, then it's fantastic. But some of that stuff you kind of think like, yeah, that could be applied in other contexts too. Just, so is this kind of perceptual thing like contrast effects not only apply to music, but they sure are big in music. Most of the music, I mean, if I think of basically any piece that I really like, I can't think of one piece that I really like, except maybe a prelude that lasts 1 minute or something, that doesn't have some kind of salient contrast at some point. Something that kind of surprises me is like, oh my God, how did we get there? And that, to me, that's one criterion for a good piece. For me, another criterion is what I would call emotional range. Like to me, the kind of composer who writes the same piece 10 times is less interesting than the composer who writes one piece that's incredibly sad, and another piece that's incredibly lively, just like that kind of emotional range. So for me, music is like an emotional voyage. When I listen to your piece, I'm saying like, okay, take me on an interesting trip and show me the sights. Show me what's interesting in this particular world. If the composer does a good job, and if it's like lively and vivid, then it's like it's worth the experience. If after 10 minutes I'm okay, yeah, I'm sleeping, well, obviously that's not a good sign. So for me, those are criteria for me anyway. And refinement also. I mean, if the composer's technique refined enough that they're not just doing the same thing all the time. That means you need to have certainly mastered. But anyway, those are, I mean, those criteria, I didn't make them up. I mean, they've been around for a long time. I don't think Brahms would have disagreed with most of those, But, it's good for a composer at some point to be thinking, okay, given my particular style, what would good music be? In my style, what would make up good music and what would be less satisfactory music? You have to think about it at some point.
It reminds me of Leonard Bernstein's like Norton lectures of talking about it. Sometimes I think it's a little bit of a strained metaphor, but it is interesting to think of music in like linguistic terms and like what does it mean to music have a language, it means to have a grammar. And for some time, but for the last couple of years, I've been more and more interested in like trying to write small sections of music that I can then pull out as like, okay, what am I doing? What's the grammar here? And then once I have a set of rules, I can say, well, I'm going to continue writing in this vein. I don't want to continue this for this amount of time. And I have a set of rules that I can then, like you were talking about, I can change one parameter or all of them.
It's the norms that you're creating a bunch of norms.
Yeah. So, but I think of them as like once you're building a language, like what harmonies are you using?
Right.
What's your, can you pull a scale out of here? What notes aren't you using?
For sure.
Ranges. There's so many ways in which, analysis can be used as a compositional tool. And what you're saying is really jiving well with what I've liked to do the past little while.
And especially analysis that isn't only limited to pitch, which is fine, but you have to pay attention to the other stuff too, because then you might discover that what your whole section has in common, let's say, is quiet little crescendos. Let's say, there's nothing ever loud, so that could be okay. Could I do something with that? Maybe at some point, if I do a piece with quiet crescendos, and then at the end I have a big crescendo, it'll be earth shaking. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a cool thing to do. Give you something you can work with. So, I mean, there's so many. There's no end to the potential when you look at it that way.
Yeah, and it's also like my I mean, I'm still in school for composition, but like looking forward to, to my terminal degree and that sort of stuff. I'm more thinking about, it's not just me coming in to lessons with pieces and getting critiques on it as much. It's like, okay, at some point that's not going to be part of my routine. And I need to get to a point where it's not all of a sudden, oh, you're on your own. It's like, I want to reach a point where it's like, I can critique my own work from a distance. Some of the stuff that you're saying it would be really helpful to not just me, but any composer looking to.
One thing that Diamond did that was fantastic in that department, like when I first came to him, as I said, I was coming from this other place where they sort of told me I wasn't a composer, right? Well, Diamond didn't agree with that. But when I first came in, I mean, at that point, I hadn't really found my own style. I was just sort of getting started. And I also had a lot of technical stuff I didn't know, especially with orchestration. Anyway, so he said, like in the first semester, what we're going to do is you won't compose. You're just going to bring in sketches every week. And you're bringing the sketches and we will talk about how to improve them. The sketch might be 10 bars or something. And then we're just going to talk about what's the potential of the sketch? What could it become eventually? How could we make it stronger or more vivid? That was a very cool idea at that stage of my work. Later on we did longer stuff, but it's just like it's sort of, first of all, I mean, I had this naive idea, which sometimes people have, is like you compose a piece from the first part to the last part. Well, that's not necessarily the case. You don't have to compose chronologically. You can, but I mean, sometimes there's situations where it doesn't work like that. And there's no advantage to seeing that as the only way. It's one way. And also it got me thinking of like, sort of have this sketch and I say, okay, said, what if we did this with it? And we did that. You might repeat this over here and so on. So it got me to think about all kinds of stuff that I never thought of what you could do with a musical idea, what its potential was. And let's face it, that's a little bit like what you're saying. You're making a sketch and you're saying, okay, so I'm going to go on like this. What do I want to keep with this? What do I want to change? And then you sort of begin to see doors opening up. You sort of, okay, I could go there, I could go here, but that's what's good. That's good that way. So this idea of working from small sketches and then exploring the various paths they can take, that, I think it's a very, very potent technique, shall we say, a very potent method for exploring your own ideas. It was certainly helpful to me. I mean, now if I do a big piece, for sure, I'm going to start with sketches. I don't start thinking I'm going to have the whole piece one into the other automatically. And the sketches, and I said, with sketches, you can go in different directions, so tomorrow you might think of something you didn't think of today. And that's cool.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the pile of sketches about that thick that I have just for my current piece.
That's good. Yeah. The first thing when a student asked me, how do I start a piece? I said, make a pile of sketches. When you show me your pile of paper, or now it's computer files, but I mean, then we can start the piece. That's good. And you might even throw some of it out. But the idea is first you just want to get a lot of stuff out there. And then eventually you start refining, what can I do more with this? This is good, not so good. Should I put this after this? You ever know the story when Carter went to see Stravinsky? That story?
Yeah, cutting everything up and laying them out, yeah.
Stravinsky's technique of cross-cutting is very audible in his music. You can hear the cross-cutting a lot of the time. But the idea that you could sort of try it, okay, could you like this? Or maybe if I do it this way, and you discover like, oh yeah, sometimes just looking at, like, if you look at idea number 1 and number 2 in a row, it's like, so sad. But then idea 1 and 3 in a row, and then 2, that's much better. That's worth thinking about, That's like, all right, you start looking for the best juxtapositions, as opposed to just assuming that the original chronology is the best one, which it isn't necessarily.
You can have like development sections that happen before the statement of a you can have like a reverse sonata form, which it could be cool.
Yeah, you can just discover all kinds of stuff just because you're letting yourself explore. You're not feeling constrained in some rigid way. And and again, this was something again that Diamond was very good with. I mean, Carter didn't do this kind of thing. I'm what you're talking about. Well, maybe this after, after that one, just getting you to thinking about sketching that way. This kind of sketching is kind of, you're like a little kid playing this stuff. You don't feel too many requirements, you just kind of have fun. Okay. And later on, the critical stuff has to come, but later, you don't want to do it at that stage. You want to have enough stuff to fool around with, and then you start, okay, this is better than that, but then again, I should do this, and you get into all of that stuff. So, it's an interesting method, I think. And, I definitely learned that from Diamond.
Yeah. Emergent narrative, emergent storytelling is something that's
Absolutely.
very, very powerful. In fact,
Absolutely.
Because one of my 4 papers, I got to write this before the end of the semester.
But it's a big act. Salience is part of that too, because in a certain idea, this is salient or that's salient, then they'll get you thinking like, okay, what is that going to go? What do I do with that? But eventually it gets interesting because, what is salient in this idea is the dynamics of the orchestration or whatever, the rhythmic motive or something. And that can set you on an interesting path if you're not too rigid about got to do it this way or got to do it that way. So, I think it's very cool.
People sometimes ask me like, oh, what do you think the future of concert music is? It's like, I'm 24. I don't know what the future of concert music is going to be. I don't know what the future of classical music holds. And that was even before the pandemic.
Sure.
Because okay, I'm pretty well read for someone my age, maybe compared to somebody else. It's like, that doesn't mean I'm qualified to answer the question.
Predicting the future is, what was that famous thing by what is it Yogi Berra, who said something about prediction is very hard, especially concerning the future.
Yeah.
You got it
I
right.
love Yogi Berra. But I was thinking, maybe you can do you think that there is or do you think we are capable of reaching a point in music where there is sort of a new common practice for composition, or is it just going to still be everybody for themselves for the rest of time trying to figure their own way?
At this point, let's face it, the common practice is movie music and video game music at this point. I mean, 95% of the people in music are in some way involved in one of those things. So that's common practice in a way. I mean, some of it is good, some of it I can't say I like very much. It's mixed, but I like video game music is one special category because it's not narrative in the same way, because you can take so many different turns in a video game. But the music isn't like a film is sort of narrative in the conventional sense, it starts and moves on, video game music can go in 20 different directions at once. So people I know who compose video game music, they can't think in the narrative sense that a film composer can, or even that I would as a classical composer. But I do think, to me at least, I think there's always going to be a place for the classical music that has this sort of narrative side to it, put it that way. To me, I don't, because to me, it's like it's an emotional voyage. And the people I know who love music, they like going on an emotional voyage like that. It's like, wow, you're showing me something I never thought of, and it's wonderful. So I think, I like that. And certainly a lot of people I know like that, whatever their particular style of music they happen to be into. So I think there's a place for that. The concert hall, obviously, well, given the pandemic, that has changed. Obviously, there's more and more stuff online. I mean, that goes without saying, and that's not going to suddenly disappear all of a sudden, I mean, these days, even if I'm doing, I'm preparing an online lesson, if I want to check out a piece and listen to it, like everybody else, I go to YouTube, and there's 7 different versions on YouTube already, right? So I have a huge bookshelf full of CDs, most of which have been untouched for years now, because I have more versions on YouTube, like everybody else, right? So live concerts, that's a trickier thing. Like I have some young performer friends, and they are facing this problem, and especially this year. Like, what do we do? I mean, one of my friends is a very good pianist, and of course, this year he hasn't done a whole lot of live playing, right? So, he's sort of wondering when it will get back up. Okay, the pandemic will be over eventually, but is the live concert? I mean, these days, I tend to say, like, if somebody wants to play a piece of mine, I'd rather they do it online. Maybe you could do it in a live concert and record it and put it online, just because not everybody's available Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock. If somebody wants to hear the piece at some other time in some other place, why not? Make it available. So, but as far as I've thought a lot about that issue about a sort of a common style or something. It's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons for that in the classical period is just they didn't have the media exposure that we have. We could have a discussion like this, and then later this afternoon, you could be listening to music from a gamelan, and I could go listen to something from a Japanese koto, and then, within 3 hours, we could be all over the world, right? Just because it's all available online, okay? That was unthinkable then. So you learned.
Maybe at a World's Fair, but,
yeah, right,
once every couple of years.
That has changed somewhat. On the other hand, I kind of feel that anybody who really has it in them to be a composer, has something to say. I don't mean verbally, but I mean they have something emotional that they want to get across. So I tend to think that a real composer at some point finds their own path, and hopefully finds it with a really good training, so that they're not lacking the technical tools to do whatever they want to do as strongly as they can. So I don't know how homogeneous it's going to get. I can't say. There certainly is some contemporary music that strikes me as ridiculous. Other stuff, I think it might not be my bag, but like, okay, you can see that, that being interesting for some people. So, but I mean, I'm just one person, and the stuff that I find ridiculous, maybe somebody else wouldn't, and vice versa, So I don't have a real answer to that question, but I do think at least the education is getting better. That I will say. There are things happening in music, and partly, as we said before, because of the internet and the fact that there, these days, if you want to like do a course in advanced math, and you can look at an online course by, let's say, the professor at MIT, and the other professor was at the University of Arkansas in some little town. Well, frankly, the chances of most people are going to end up looking at the MIT guy. It might not be better, but the chances are he's more important in that area. So it creates a kind of competition that's healthy, I think. Because people don't have to. When I see people still taking counterpoint lessons, saying, "Well, I'm not allowed to do this. I'm not allowed to do that." I'm saying, "Well, that's not the only way there is to look at this." And I can give you references online to people that explain this kind of stuff in a better way. So I think that has something to do. But who knows? As we said, Yogi Berra got it right. Predictions are hard, especially about the future.